Oh, good. He was born in Lowell, Massachusetts, and in 1834. His father was a railway engineer. He was the he was the son of the second wife. This is important because eventually he becomes very friendly with his half sister, who was, of course, the daughter of the woman before his mother. His mother actually came from Carolina, and she was called McNeil. And although he was all born as just James Whistler, he himself, when he came to England, came to Europe, he put the name of McNeil. He always called himself James McNeil Whistler, because it appears that in South Carolina, the family were moderately aristocratic, I think, by comparison. And when the Civil War came, his brother was in the Civil War. Of course, he was on the side of the South. And if Whistler had stayed in the army, because when he went he originally became part of in the school of the army. He would have had to have gone to the Civil War, and he presumably would have been on the south side, which is interesting. But anyway, he was born, as I say, in 34, and he was the father became an engineer in Russia. He became the railway engineer, the man who was going to join Moscow and St. Petersburg together. So he was brought up as a little boy in Russia, and he had his first sort of drawing lessons, I think, in the imperial court. And there was no doubt about it. They had a really very, very glamorous time. But they went back to America, and when they were there, his father died of cholera, and so from being moderately wealthy, she found herself as a widow with two children back in Lowell, Massachusetts, and luckily there was enough money to put him into the military academy at West Point. And for a while, he looked as if he was enjoying it, but he couldn't deal with with chemistry or something. He drew very well. They taught him to etch, which was interesting, but he was kicked out in 1854. And he had a little bit of money, not much, but a little bit, and that had been left over by his father. And so he took himself off to Paris in 1855, and he never went back to America, although he always called himself an American. He remained in America. He didn't take up nationality or anything, but he never went back. And what we're looking at here is that really funny one on the left. That's an etching of himself, which is rather sweet. It's a self-portrait of 1859. He went, as I say, to Paris in 1855, where he went to the sort of studio of Glare. Now, Glare was an interesting, not a particularly good painter, but he had a very, very good studio group surrounding him. And actually there he met his friend Fantin Latour, and he also met Pissarro because he was in the same group as that. And then, I mean, he actually thoroughly enjoyed being in Paris because he had this sort of rather glamorous bohemian lifestyle, which he absolutely adored. And this is where he began really quite seriously to do etching a little bit. Now, the picture you're seeing on the left is that one of 1859, with that funny hat on, this he used to wear all the time, it appears. He was always a dandy. I gather he wasn't a very big, tall man, but he was very slender, and he always had a cane. And later on, he had a monocle, and he was a bit of a dandy. And the picture on the right, which is the last self-portrait he did, I put the first and the last on. And this particular self-portrait, which he did in 1896, he said to his sister-in-law, who became his executrix, that this is the painting he wanted to be remembered by. So this is why I put it on. But this is the very last one. So we put the next two on, and I'll show you what it was like when he went to Paris for the first time. What did he see in Paris? What was all the fuss and what was all it was Courbet. And this particular Courbet, this particular one, which is called the Studio, which was painted in 1853 and 1855. Now, the year that he got to Paris was the year of the international exhibition, French international exhibition. And Courbet was not, he was considered so outrageous by the Salon group that he wasn't allowed to take part in it. So he up and made his own sort of little gallery next to it. And this is where he put this studio. And this particular picture became the sort of the scandal of the time. The top picture, he was very good looking as a young man. And the top one is him as a young man. And of course, the one on the right, you all know, is a very famous one, the Stonebreakers. And that's 1855. And of course, as I said, the studio is 53, 55. Now, what is important about him about this is he becomes, he was a sort of the head of the avant-garde. He was the head of the realist school, and he became friendly with the young Whistler. And this friendship continues their entire life. And for a long time, it was Courbet to whom the young Whistler looked when he was looking for but he was really the head of the realist school. Okay, let's have the next one. And now I'll show you what made his first reputation. As I say, he learnt to etch a little bit when he was in the army. But when he came to England, he stayed with his half sister, Deborah, and she'd married to a physician who happened to be interested in etching. And he had a great mass of Rembrandt's etchings. And it was those plus a book of Hogarth that interested the young Whistler. Now, what we're looking at now is what he called his French set. These are the first etchings that were published, and they are really quite remarkable when you think of them. He's a very young man, and this particular group, the one on the left actually was called the Mustard Cellar. It doesn't really matter what it is called, because I just want you to look at the very interesting way that look at the way he used the drawing for it is extraordinary. Because what you have to realize about etching, I'll say it straight away, he actually worked with the plate. He went out and he actually worked directly from nature with the plate in his hand. Now, what the plate was, it had a sort of black, soft black, and the very, very thin sort of needle was what he worked. But you always must remember that when you're looking at these etchings, what you're seeing is the reverse, you see, because when they were printed, they came up the other side.
When the image is lifted, it's a mirror image.
It's mirror image is what you're seeing. And when you look carefully at the one on the left, you'll see how extraordinarily interesting is the difference between the very dark blacks. And what actually happened is that when he was working, he would actually impress these things 2 or 3 times before he actually had the final one, which was eventually published. Now, the image in the middle is interesting because that is Rembrandt. And this is what he was looking at, of course, very firmly all of his life. This particular one happened, I chose this one. It was in 1650 and it's called 3 Gable Cottages. But really, I wanted you to look at the way that the needle that Rembrandt was using the needle, and look at and compare it with Whistler's much more free hand on the left. Now, the one on the right, which I think is absolutely extraordinary, was the Unsafe Tenement. These were all part of this, what he called the French set. And really the amount of the change in the color of the blacks and the grays are absolutely extraordinary. Now, these were published when he came back to England. He came to England. They were actually published. They were printed in France, and they were a great success. They're actually exhibited in the Salon. And at the time, a couple of English people bought some of them. And he got this idea, his half-sister was living in England anyway.
And
he got the idea that he'd go to England because he thought there was a certain amount of, he thought the idea of making money was there. There were people at this particular time, we're talking about 1859, England was just at the beginning of her success in terms of the Industrial Revolution. And so London was a very busy place. Okay, next to, and you'll see what they look like. Now, this is his sister, Deborah, with her little girl called Annie. And this particular picture was the first time he did a large painting. Now, this is quite remarkable this was painted in 1858, 1859. And it was actually, he put it on into the French salon, but it was rejected. But interestingly, the Royal Academy accepted it. And this was accepted at the Royal Academy in 1860. So this very young man, totally unknown, got into the Royal Academy. And what is interesting is the one on the right, which was one of the very earliest of his etchings, and this is Reading by Lamplight, and this is 1858. And it so happened, you see, that his brother-in-law was an amateur etcher, and it was really at his house, and he lived in Belgrave Square. And at the time, I mean, this picture was admired. Now, we're talking, this is very, very early, and the particular kind of rather simple composition is something that remains with him all the time. Let's look at the next one. Now, this one, which I think is a rather odd one, it doesn't quite work. It's called The Family. And again, it's same time, 1859. Now, what you're actually looking at, and you remember that I was explaining, he always worked from the model, always. And what you're actually seeing is his sister in the mirror on the left, a friend leaving the room, it's the music room, and his niece sitting reading on the side there. And as you see, it's a bit muddled. You're not quite sure perspectively where everybody is, if you see what I mean. It's a weird composition. It's very, and look at all the paintings at the back, tremendous amount of detail. And this, of course, was actually, it was called Harmony. Later on, he called it Harmony in Green, but it really was originally called the Music Room, and it was painted at much the same time as the piano. And that, I think, that was exhibited. That didn't get into the Royal Academy, but he had, when he was in Paris, strangely enough, he became interested in he got friendly with Leonardo Ionides, who was the son of a very, very wealthy Greek ship owner, and his father, when he came back to England, his father actually commissioned this particular picture we're looking at the right, and it's Battersea Bridge, and it was done between 1859 and 1863. Now, what is interesting, you see, he's always interested in cities, and at that moment, London was the sort of commercial centre of the world, and particularly the river. This is where all the transportation came. And this is the old, by the way, this is the old Battersea Bridge. And we're on the south side, and we're looking towards the north side on the other side. And that is eventually will be Chelsea. This is where he lived. You can see the houses on the other side. But this particular one was bad. This is the very first painting that we can see. Okay, next one. Now these, at this time, he does the Thames set. And these are quite remarkable. They are quite extraordinary when you think of the detail that you're looking at these. They are really rather amazing. The Thames set was actually done by 61. It was not actually published generally until 1871. Now, I want you to remember last lecture, who was in London in 1871? Van Gogh. And Van Gogh must have known these because they were tremendously successful, and everybody knew about them by 71. He was famous for his etching. And I remember that Van Gogh was teaching himself to draw by looking at illustrations from newspapers. He must have known about these. I haven't been able to find any detailed information about this. It just occurred to me that they were at the same time. But I want you to look at this really carefully, because this Black Lion Wharf, it's a sign plate. And I want you to look at this and realize, look at the very, very incredible composition here. This man is sitting right in the front, and we're looking right back on the other side of the river. Look at the detail of all those houses and the ships as they're coming down. And the astonishing thing, remember that he's backwards. This is backwards. And you see Black Lion's Wharf at the top right here, at the top here, up there. Amazingly, he had to do this backwards, of course. Otherwise, it wouldn't have come. And the one on the right, I think, this was a very famous one. This is the Lyme burners. It's Rotherhithe. Now, I want you to see again the detail. You see the man standing there, and then right through this very strange, broken down building, you can see the Thames in the background, you see. You go right the way through this beautiful piece of work. These are quite
the composition is
they're amazing,
here.
very, they're extraordinary thing. Now, the reason that this Black Lion Wharf I've put on this particular one, in fact, there were 16, and you could have chosen it, one could have chosen any of them, but this one actually turns up in Whistler's Mother. I'll show you in a moment. It's at the top there. Now, this is, again, is the new Westminster Bridge being built. It's called the last of the old Westminster. It's 1862, and the old bridge is being pulled down, and the new one is being built on the left. And there you see on the right, one of the Thames set, and this is Rotherhithe of roughly 1860. The two men sitting down there. We're going to see this composition again, but we really do get a sense of the sheer amount of activity that was going on at the Thames at this particular time. Okay, next one. And we'll look now, this one, which is absolutely wonderful, I think, the Thames in Ice. This is 1861-62. It gives us an idea of the actual paint quality is much thicker. Again, at the top, it's Westminster Bridge. You can see the Houses of Parliament in the back there. And the one underneath is Battersea Bridge. And you've got this really free kind of paint quality here coming on. Now you'll notice that his colors are always black is very important to him. When he went to this glass studio was his particular advice was always black is the most important part of the color. It was emphasized that Ingres was the person to look for drawing, and this particular series of ideas stayed with Whistler for his whole of his life. And you'll find his color is always very much on dark, somber side. Okay, next one, always next one, and here are the ones which we do see in the exhibition. The picture on the left, this is Joe. This is the first time we see Joe. Now, Joe Hifferman was his mistress for several years. And this particular picture is called Wapping. And this is the first time we see her. She had red hair, and she was considered extremely beautiful. Now, the figure in the middle is his friend posing for it. He's a man called Alphonse Ligure, and again, he was one of these other painters who are in the glass studio. Now look carefully at the distance of the paint of the combination of all the ships on the right, and the one on the right is Camilla's detail. So it gives the one on the right is the real color, and the other one comes from a book, of course. It's just slightly different, and you just get a much more clear idea of the painting of
you also notice this really interesting diagonal of this blue.
It's beautiful, isn't it, that blue?
That sort of almost directs your eye to his friend.
And if you can see the details, they say at the back of the ships.
But it's also interesting because I just noticed this.
Yeah.
The edge of this like a porch that they're sitting on, this terrace that they're sitting on, is continued past her behind Hifferman as well. So there's an interesting axis here as well. Cool.
Actually, you see, at the time, this was considered extremely bad taste, because who wanted to see pictures of these ragamuffins, these poor, I mean, presumably they were meant to be sort of sailors or longshoremen and all that sort of thing. And these pictures, the idea, but you see, remember that he'd been looking at Courbet, and he really was, as far as he was concerned, he was a realist at this time, and he was trying to show realist pictures. It didn't get exhibited at the Royal Academy. Now, what I'm showing you here is, I really want to give you an idea of what was considered acceptable in the salons at the time, because at the top left, right at the top left, we've got Royal Academy. This is Landseer. It's by Landseer, and it is a challenge at Waterloo, it's called, and it's the 1850s. And this is the kind of picture which was the popular picture of the Royal Academy at the time. And they basically were telling stories. They were all telling stories. It was like having a novel, really. They all had a strong narrative. And this is something that really irritated Whistler. Now, underneath the Landseer at the top, you've got a Bouguereau. I deliberately chose a big Bouguereau because he was very, very popular. And this kind of sort of near nudity was acceptable, providing it was sort of clothed in sort of Psyche. And this particular one is called, of course, Cupid Psyche. And in particular, it's called in sort of romantic, classical myth. It was all right. Now, on the right is what the French salon, the kind of picture that which was, if you accepted the salon, this is the kind of picture you would have seen. And you see the top there, there's a sort of, that you can see the kind of Bouguereau type nudes that were acceptable. Now, this is the 1860s, and this is roughly the same time that he was that Whistler was painting Joe. Okay, let's have the next one. And you'll see the first important picture, which is in the exhibition. And this is called, he's called it the Symphony in White, but it was always called the White Girl. And it was 1861 to 63. Now, for some extraordinary reason, he tried to put it on the Royal Academy, and it was refused. Now, for some reason or another, they found this particular picture slightly sort of, they were questioning it. Why was she wearing white? Why was she in front of white? Why was she holding a lily? Was it about innocence or was it about decadence? They couldn't make up their mind. And she was standing, of course, on this bare rug. This was considered such an extraordinary picture that nobody could believe it. And it was refused, of course. But at this particular time, there'd been so many pictures in the French Academy, French salon refused, that they actually put together a series of pictures, which was called the Salon des Refusés. And of course, what was in the Salon des Refusés? Of course, Manet's Déjeuner sur l'herbe. Now, these two pictures, Déjeuner sur l'herbe and Whistler's White Girl, were the scandal of the period. We know about the Manet, the idea of nude people in the country with two men and so on and so forth. This was considered salacious and but why on earth, I still can't quite understand why they regarded this picture of Joe as being salacious. I find that difficult to understand. Top right, you see, he signs himself. He's signing his name. He hasn't started to use his butterfly thing yet. But next one, you're going to see some details of this one. Look at this extraordinary detail of the bare rug. Isn't it amazing? And this is, again, Camilla's detail from the exhibition. Look at the paint quality. It's terribly interesting. You get on these details, you see for the first time, you see the difference between the painting of that tiny little white flower and the rest of the painting of the
texture,
of the carpet and the dog. It's really quite extraordinary, isn't it? You're quite convinced that this is fur and the other one is wool, and the lightness of the flowers. Beautifully done, beautifully done. Okay, next one. These are the pictures that are in the exhibition, not all, not specifically. These are the people who were actually the avant-garde, so to speak, who were looking at the Whistler White Girl, because it caused all this tremendous sensation. It really was extraordinary. And this particular one on the left is, of course, Renoir. This is Renoir's Lise with an Umbrella of 1867. The one in the middle I thought was absolutely fantastic. This is Gustav Klimt. But this particular lady is important. She was his sister, and she was Margaret Stoneborough Wittgenstein. She was Wittgenstein's sister, and this was painted in 1905. But the one on the right, we'll have forgotten what a good painter she was. This is Berthe Morisot, and this is called the Psyche Mirror, and it's 1878. So the first person to look at the idea of doing the White Girl was Renoir, and then of course it became popular, and you see Morisot using it. But finally, in 1905, it was used by all sorts of people. There was no doubt about it. It was because of Whistler. Whistler, next one. The next one is perhaps one of the most interesting, and this is a Symphony in White Number Two. Now these are Joe, and what you're seeing here again, we have to thank Camilla for these. These are the details. But this is a very, very important picture, because this picture shows something that's happening to all over Europe. Now, what is happening is the sudden understanding of the difference between Europe and Asia, because suddenly flooding into the market was the Chinese blue and white china, which became an absolute passion in the 60s. And there you see it in this picture, Camilla, particularly truthfully on Camilla's detail. But more interestingly, she's holding in her hand the Japanese fan. Now, at this particular moment, we're talking about the 1860s. This stuff was flooding in on the market. What had actually happened is Japan was opened to Europe in 1853. It was opened by an American ship. They discovered Japan. Suddenly there was this new extraordinary imagery seen. And in China, the French and the British were having the Opium Wars at much the same time, actually, 56 to 60. Now, as far as the Europeans were concerned, they didn't know the difference. As far as they were concerned, China and Chinese and Japanese images were from the same thing. So they mixed up the idea between China and Japan. I think this is very interesting. Now look at this carefully. The picture shows Joe, of course, looking in the mirror. Now the interesting thing, the figure and the side view we've got is quite different from that of the one in the mirror. She looks much more anxious somehow. But what is so interesting, you see, we've got both the blue and white china by her touch with her hand touching, and in the other hand, she's got the Japanese fan. Now, this particular combination, this particular interest in Japan really got involved into Whistler's idea of composition, which we'll see later on.
She's also wearing a wedding ring. I noticed that do you notice that? She's wearing a wedding ring.
Yes, she is. I don't know that she was married. I don't know why he put this on.
But it's interesting that he should paint her, because that's her left hand. She's wearing a wedding ring. And then her reflection in the mirror is looking at the wedding ring.
Oh, I hadn't thought about that. That's interesting.
I wonder what that means.
Mind you, you see, the relationship they had was interesting. She stayed for his mistress for a while. Then they gave up, but they became great friends. And for a long time, she organized his business because he was a frightful businessman. I mean, she would write the letters to the customers and so on. Mm. But she died in 1886. He never married her, but at the time he left. He'd known she was going to die. He'd done his will, and she became his sort of. She was going to be inherited. She was going to be his heir, but she died long before him, in 86. But they had a long conversation. Now here she is again, and this particular one is Symphony Number Two, and the girl on the left was just a model, and she was called actually Millie Jones. And this is 1865, 67, and this is Symphony in White Number 3, and this is Hifferman again, Joe, and this was exhibited in the Royal Academy in 1867, and in 1866, which we'll talk about in a moment, he went on this extraordinary river trip. But notice again his handwriting at the bottom: Symphony in White Number 3, Whistler, and the date. And he always noticed the flowers on the right, which usually seem to be quite generally interesting. Now, what he's looking at actually at this moment, he's looking at Japanese, like everybody else is going to, Japanese woodblocks. And again, there's a Japanese fan, as you see on the front here. You've got this rather strange flattened perspectival space, and she's not really sure. She's not really sitting on that chair very comfortably, that sofa very comfortably. But of course, it's all the whites together that are so interesting. But this is the third one. Well, we're now roughly 18. This was 1865, 67. The next one is going to show perhaps the first time he became sort of interested, fashionable in Paris. And this particular picture was done by his friend Fantin Latour. He's going to write to Fantin Latour all of his life, and we know much more about his intimate life because of these letters. Now, this particular picture is interesting because it's homage to Delacroix. Now, what had happened is that Delacroix had died the year before. And Fantin, who was, in the end, he was actually he's famous really for a painter of flowers. You can see right in the center there, the flowers. Then, of course, the painting of Delacroix at the back. Now, what is fascinating is that these are all the group of the beginning of the avant-garde. Right in the front, standing up firmly, is Whistler. Now, on the left, you see the photograph of what was taken of the people, and you see who they are. Now, you're going to see Durante again. There's Fantin Latour. These are all the people. There's Baudelaire there, and there's this Alphonse Ligure that we'd seen before. There's Whistler, there's Manet, Bracamont, and people that I don't know. Manet is the figure on the right here. This is Manet. This is Manet here. And later on, there's going to be another painting by Fantin Latour, which is a sort of homage to Manet later on. Now, this was 1864. And this particular picture here is Caprice in purple and gold. And it's called The Golden Screen. And for the first time, we see the evidence of the interest in Japanese prints. And you see on the floor in front of her are all of these prints by Hiroshige. And the lower left is from the exhibition. Camilla took this one, the other two came from books. But they're all in Hiroshige. Now, again, if you look on it very carefully on this picture and examine it, on the lower left, you'll see again the blue and white. Now, this particular blue and white became an absolute passion, and all the avant-garde, all the intellectuals collected the Chinese blue and white pottery. Whistler had an enormous amount of it. She's wearing a kind of Chinese type.
Japanese.
But it's not entirely Japanese, you see. They say that the material is probably Chinese. They don't know.
Oh.
And the golden screen behind is certainly very much Japanese. And you see that rather thin, elegant chair on the side there. This is perhaps when you're really seeing him using Japanese composition. Look at the composition carefully of the Japanese Hiroshige, particularly the ones at the top, the Mount Etna ones at the thing, and you see that the way there's flattened pattern, and the way the pattern is all on the surface. And this is what he's going to take on. Now, the odd thing, the next one is this particular one is the third of this particular one, his most Japanese one. And this one is called Purple and Rose, the Lang Lyson of the 6 marks. And I didn't know what this was about. Well, it appears that the Lang Lyson and the 6 marks refer to the signature of the people who designed the blue pottery. And underneath the blue pottery, this is where they would see their signature, and this is what this refers to. And this is the Lang Lyson one. Now look at them again. You see again, you've got this strange mixture of, particularly in this case, a lot of pottery, and she's wearing again something Chinese costume. But the image on the right is very important because this is the frame. Now, by now, he is very, very anxious about his frames. He has his frames very carefully made. And if you notice these, look at it carefully, you'll see the butterfly, which is going to take over as his signature. He's going to stop signing his name and he's going to use the butterfly. And there you see it carefully on the detail that Camilla made. Again, the color of those are much more accurate than the one on the left. Not that they're too bad, but it's interesting to see this sheer amount of this blue and white china. And it was extremely expensive, but it was the great collector. What they really, very, very strange, but what people had in common, they got to meet each other at the auctions when they were buying this blue and white china, and they became a kind of coterie of people who actually did buy it. And these actually were in the end, turned out to be his patrons. Okay, next one. Now, here is the last time we're going to see Joe on the left there. And it's the artist in his studio. And this was 1865, 72, and there he is, you see. And the one on the right, in the middle, is the balcony. And it was called Variations in Flesh Color. And what you're looking at, he now is moving into this house. He's going to stay for about 7 or 8 years. It's called Lindsay House, and I believe they still exist in Chelsea. And they're back onto the river directly, and you're looking across the Thames. And to the left, you're looking towards Battersea. And the picture, particularly on the right, he had lots and lots of attempts at. There's lots and lots of sketches that refer to this particular one. And it was finally finished in 1864. Now, these pictures at the moment, this one is at the Freer collection. An awful lot, we'll talk about it later, but this particular man, Freer, collected masses of whistlers, and this is where you see most of them in Washington now. Now, the picture on the right is perhaps the most Japanese in composition, because look at the flatness. This particular one is called Violet and Green. It was painted in 1871, and it does refer to the Japanese print. And it is, in fact, from, again, looking out of the window across the Thames, and we're looking directly. And the title was Violet and Green was put on later, but the perspectival space is very Japanese. Okay, next one. Now, he friendship with Courbet continues, and Courbet comes to England, and they go out on a holiday. They go to Trouville. This time Joe is with him. This is 1865, and Joe is still with him all the time. Incidentally, I should have mentioned that the figure in white, the first one, was painted in Paris. Joe was in Paris with him. They moved about together all the time. This particular time they were at Trouville. Now the paintings of the sea is very interesting because the one on the left is Courbet. I've deliberately chosen this particular one is the shore at Trouville, and it's both of them 1865. But the one on the right, and the exhibition, there are several of these, and this particular one was blue and silver of Whistler. And I want to note you notice the sort of the change. Whistler's much more delicate, much lighter. And Courbet seems much heavier by comparison. He's already beginning to, because of this interest in Japanese art, he's moving away very firmly from realism that he'd been thinking about before. And what is going to happen is that he now is going to go on this extraordinary trip first of all, we'll look at Courbet's pictures of Joe, because these pictures are in the exhibition. And Courbet painted Joe, first one, they're all painted in 65, but the one in the middle is very firmly, it's called The Beautiful Irish Girl. And this is what Joe looked like to Courbet. And Courbet used this picture again and again in many of his works. She became his particular idea of a beautiful woman. There's some talk that very infamous picture, which is now in the Orsay, of the kind of the vagina, the one that you're looking at, literally looking up. There's some talk that Joe posed for that, and certainly at the end of this little holiday, that the relationship between she and Whistler stopped. The drawing on the right is an etching, and it's weary, and it's got this marvelous hair that she had, and that is Whistler, of course. That was a little earlier. That was 1863, 2 years earlier. But basically, the difference, I wanted you really to see the relative heaviness of this painting by comparison with the delicacy of Whistler. Okay, next one. Now, this is the most interesting thing. Now, goodness knows why. But at this particular moment, and here I think we're going to have to ask Camilla, who comes from Chile, so she knows a bit more about it than I do. But for some reason, Chile and Spain were at war together. Now, what was it about, Camilla?
It was, Spain colonized Chile and Argentina and some parts of South America. So it was probably the war for independence.
I think it was.
And you say he was over there at the invitation of the Spanish.
No. He didn't. As a matter of fact, he most surprisingly, he went on behalf of the Chileans. It was the Chileans who were trying to escape from Spain, and Spain came with all their ships, and America came in to help Chileans. And so the picture on the left has got both of the sort of the warships.
And what years were this?
This is 1860. This is 1866.
Okay.
1866. And the place is called Valparaiso.
Valparaiso, yes.
Valparaiso.
So
Yeah.
The kind of national global recognition of Chilean independence was 1828. So it was about 40 years before he painted this. But at the beginning of the 1800s, in 1808, I'm just reading here, it was Napoleon's French armies that were invading Spain, captured the Spanish monarch, Ferdinand VII. And this invasion sparked revolutionary movements in Spain's American colonies. And that's when, after sort of fighting for their independence, Chile declared independence September 18th, 1810.
But
this was much later.
This is much later. But what is interesting about this picture, we don't know why. There's all sorts of discussions about why Whistler should suddenly take off and go off and join. He was going to sort of join the Chilean army, but he never did. When he got there, I think it was all over. But what he does do, he comes back and he paints the warships, And if you see that they're both the sailing ships, and in the far distant, you see the beginning of the sort of the steamship. And these are the warships of both, I gather, of Spain, as the Spanish ships and also the American ones. But this was painted in the 1870s. The one in the middle is the sketch for the harbour. And there you see the more up-to-date ship in the background. And notice again the composition. It's very Japanese, in fact. Now, this is the one on the right is very, very important. You can hardly see it. It's now in the Freer collection. I don't remember seeing this picture, but this is called Blue and Gold, Valparaiso. Now, why this is important is this, they say very firmly that this is the beginning of the nocturnes. Now look at it carefully and you can just about see the image. The image on the left is very clear. You can see very, very clearly see the ships and the sea and so on, and less so in the one, the sketch was after all only the sketch of the harbour. When you look at the right, you really have to peer to see there's that you're looking at the harbour in the front, and then you can see the ship in the middle distance, and those tiny, tiny lights. This is the first time we see a night picture of his, and everybody believes that this was the beginning of the nocturnes, and this is dated 1871-72, and of course he came back to England by this time. He didn't stay very long. It was sort of 3 or 4 months or something. Okay, next.
So just really quickly, a bit of history. The reason why he was in Chile was because Spain invaded a group of islands off of the Peruvian coast called the Chinchilla Islands in 1864.
Oh, okay.
And so then there was a peacekeeping mission that was sent over by, I believe it was the French, the British, and another country. No, it was the French and British. And so this is why Whistler was there to help with the cause. Apparently he traveled over there to help. And apparently in this one, there is a French tricolor flag somewhere.
Somewhere, we can't
somewhere
see it.
in here. I'm not sure if it's this grouping or not.
Might be. No.
But he did sort of.
They're all mixtures. But what is so interesting is, can we just go back, because I keep on about this, but this is terribly important. The picture on the right is very, very important, because one has to say to oneself, in the end, these pictures really turn out to be almost entirely abstract. And this is the first time we see him painting night, deliberately painting. And remember that he was a man who was painting as the Impressionists were. He was actually painting in front of the object, whatever it is he was painting. Okay, next one.
Manet was doing marine views.
Exactly. Okay, next one. Now, this is when he's come back to London. And we're seeing the first of the one here. It's very early morning, this one. And it's Symphony in Grey. And it's 1871. Again, it's from his balcony. And now, can you see on the left? That's his signature. You've got his butterfly signature on the left there. And look at the picture, looking across the Thames. And the one on the right is Variation Pink and Grey, Chelsea. And it's from his balcony. And again, you've got very, very much Japanese kind of composition. The flatness and the way the water is absolutely at the top. You're looking down and up at the same time, do you see? And you're really beginning, it's really beginning to be almost abstraction.
But it also looks like Japanese landscape painting.
Yes, it does.
Kind of the winding from the top down to the different sort of landscapes.
But I do think it's so interesting because you see that you get one set of viewpoint of the figures.
different grounds, right? So foreground, middle ground.
Yes, exactly. It's very strange, isn't it? I mean, at the time, it's extraordinary. Okay, next one. These are amazing. Now, this is when we get really quite seriously, almost to abstract pictures. This particular one is Nocturne, Blue and Silver, the one on the left. And this is 1872. And this is signed by the butterfly. Can you see in the middle at the bottom here, the butterfly? Now, the only way you can see you're looking at water and earth and the the distant shore is a sort of bits of light. They're painted either in the early morning or late at night. The other one, the blue and silver, you're looking towards Cremone. Now the Cremone area, it appears this is a place where they originally had a huge sort of dancing place that everybody went through at night. It was a sort of an outdoor space. And you can see that this is again the nighttime, and you can see the lights of the sort of fairground sort of stage in the top right here on that one. And that's, they say that was painted probably from Battersea Bridge, because you're standing, if you can see both the left-hand side of the Thames and the right-hand side of the Thames in this one, where in this one you see you're looking directly across, but here you can see the two shapes here, and they're extraordinarily beautiful. Okay, next one. I mean, nobody's ever seen anything like these before. This one is Nocturne in blue and silver, and this is Battersea Reach. He's standing actually on a bridge, because on the right, that big shape on the right, it appears, is the Houses of Parliament. And you can see again, you're seeing both the left and the right-hand side of the river. And you're looking backwards, right in the background, it's probably Westminster Bridge, but we don't know. But the one on the right, you see, is the one I think is absolutely extraordinary. And this is Nocturne in grey and silver. And this is now in Philadelphia. And this is painted by moonlight. And these are all painted probably from the balcony of the Lindsay house where he lives. You can just see the light. Now, if that didn't have a light on it, this is what I mean. If you put these up with a Rothko, they'd look very, very similar. Nobody was painting like this before. They were anywhere. They're so mystical, really. They're really beautiful. This particular one is again Nocturne blue and silver, and this is Battersea Reach. These are all between 70 and 75. And they're painted with very, very thin paint. And they say that it didn't last very long. So quite often he would have another little go at them and sort of 10 or something years later. So there are lots of different paintings. But I do think it's so interesting. When you look at them very carefully, you can see these tiny lights from the other side of the river that you're looking at here. The one on the right is grey. This foreground, they think the foreground might be just in the left hand here. They're newly building the embankment at this time. And this is one of the last ones. This was 75 to 77. Now, these particular pictures are going to be in a sense, his undoing financially. At this particular moment, he's doing very well. He's exhibiting all over the place. He's got the new gallery, the Grosvenor Gallery is opening up. He's showing there. There's enormous. He has great sort of lunches, which all the artists come. He's very friendly with the Rossetti, whole of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. He's got interested in a painter called Albert Moore, and he's very, very much part of the scene. He's spending money like mad. He and Jo are no longer together. He's got a new girlfriend called Maud Franklin. Okay, next one. And here we have perhaps the one that we personally in this country know best, because this is the one that's in the Tate. And this particular one is interesting because you can see it's Nocturne blue and gold, and it's old Battersea Bridge. And what was interesting, I managed to find an etching top right, and you're looking at the old Battersea Bridge at the top there. This is one of his etchings from Lindsay House there. And if you look at this one here, which of course is changed, that there's a strange gondola figure at the bottom here. So it's not a gondola, it looks like a gondola. And that's the one that we've got in the Tate. And right at the bottom center, I managed to find this Hiroshige woodcut. And it's a woodcut, it's a far of the bridge at the bottom here. And you can see the composition there. The big argument was, are there figures at the top of the bridge? And the bridge was like this. The bridge was actually pulled down. Now, the one on the right is the one that caused all the problem. This was shown in Grosvenor Gallery. which had just opened in 1877. Both of these two were shown at that particular time. And at this moment, Ruskin was perhaps one of the most famous critics of the time. He was the one, of course, that had supported the Pre-Raphaelites. When he saw this picture, he was absolutely offended beyond belief. What we're looking at, actually, is Cremone Gardens again at night, a picture on the right, and it's called Nocturne in black and gold, the fallen rocket. And it was no more abstract than any of the others, but for some reason or another, Ruskin took tremendous offense at this picture, and he called it an absolute nonsense. And he said that he flinging a pot of paint in the public's face. It wouldn't have mattered if he hadn't have published it, and he was very, very, very well known. When he published it, saying what absolute rubbish it was, and how could anybody ask 100 guineas for flinging the pot of paint in the public's face? This was too much. And it was published in the newspapers, and there was a great deal, huge scandal, tremendous backlash. And poor old Whistler got so fed up about this that he took him to court, and he lost. Now, right at the same time, a little bit earlier, I wanted to put those together because I thought they belonged together, but at the same time, he was doing these extraordinary portraits. Now, the portrait, the one on the left, is the most famous one. And this is he called it Arrangement in Grey and Black. And it's a painting of his mother. Now, this is, as it happens, they all say. Now, if you look on the wall, you'll see that wharf, the Black Lion wharf, which is on the wall at the back. And the paint and the curtains on the left are very, very kind of Japanese in sense. But look at the composition. It's very, very simple, tremendously simple. And it became Carlyle. It turns out Thomas Carlyle lived down the street, and he knew Whistler. They knew each other. And Carlyle saw this particular picture. It was exhibited in the Royal Academy, and it was the last painting he ever put in the Royal Academy. The critics thought it was awful. They said, well, how could he paint this poor old lady and all this nonsense, and very bad reviews. But Carlyle liked it. And he used to see Whistler from time to time, and they'd meet in the street. And so he asked him to paint himself. And this picture was painted when Carlyle was 78. And it's one of the most beautiful pictures. And it's very, very, very interesting, nostalgic picture of he'd lost his wife, and he was regretful of his behavior towards his wife. And it's a picture which is about sadness, really. Wonderful shape, very much like the picture of his mother. It was painted actually it was actually painted in 73. And he was 78, as I say. Interestingly, this is the very first picture of his ever to get to a museum. And it was bought by the Glasgow Museum as one of the first pictures he ever went into a museum, was this picture of Carlyle. Again, it was not well received by the public, but the picture of the mother is very interesting. And as I said at the beginning, one of the things that's very strange, I saw this on the television, that in the 1930s, at the time of the Great Depression in America, they made the president talked about this particular picture, and they made a stamp of it, and this picture became sort of the most famous American picture, and she became sort of the universal mother. And so everybody in America knows this picture of Whistler's mother. Okay, next one, because these are some of the most interesting. These are the arrangements. Now, these were painted before the scandal. These particular pictures were painted before the scandal. So they're painted between 1971, 1973, that sort of time, except the one on the end, that's 76. But these are all painted at roughly the same time. Now, the picture on the left is a woman called Mrs. Louis Huff, and her husband was a collector of this blue and white china. And they all belonged to something called the Burlington Club. And this is where they all met to talk about the china. Now, this particular picture, again, you see on the left, you see his signature with the butterfly. And in the center, you've got this beautiful one, which is called Harmony in Grey and Green. Now, this little girl is called Miss Cecily Alexander. And Alexander was a banker, enormously wealthy banker. He had a number of children. And this little girl was 8 years old. And when Whistler saw it, he wanted her to paint. Whistler was painting, Alexander wanted him to paint his children, but not specifically Cecily, because he thought she was too young. Anyway, Whistler saw her, and this is what he decided he wanted to paint. Now, he didn't just decide he wanted to paint her. He absolutely insisted on designing the dress, going out and buying the cloth, because it had to be very, very fine. It had to be starched in a certain way so that it stood out in a certain way. The feather on the hat, the green feather on the hat, was carefully chosen. Everything was chosen by Whistler. The dress was designed by it. And this poor little girl, she said later on, when somebody actually went to visit see her, when she was about 30, she said she was absolutely exhausted. She was furious, and she was so tired. She actually posed, I think they said something like, did he say 70 hours or something dark? Yes, he had 70 sittings for it. Everybody said that when they posed for him, it was ghastly because he went on and on and on. But this, as she said, she looks very, very bad-tempered. And she said she was possibly tired. She was so tired, he wouldn't let her move. And at one time, she got these little shoes that he very carefully bought with the little toes. And the pose is that of a dancer. She was doing dancing lessons at the time. And you see in this case, his signature of the butterfly is part of the composition. It's extraordinary composition. Look at the tiny flowers here, and those tiny little butterflies at the top there. It's a beautiful painting, that one. We've got that one, that's in the tape. Now, so can we back again, darling? I haven't finished on. Now, the person on the right is interesting because that's Henry Irving, Sir Henry Irving. And he's an actor, and he's a very famous actor of the day. And he's in a play about Mary Stuart, and he's dressed as Philip II of Spain. And that was painted in 1876. And again, Whistler called it a sketch, and he said he did it in a very short time. Later on, Irving said, not at all. He actually sat for 20 sittings. So there you are. When you went to pose for Whistler, you went on for hours and hours. It became a way of life. Okay, next one. And here we have perhaps the most important of all of his patrons. Now, this particular gentleman was called Frederick William Leyland. Now, he came from Liverpool, actually. He was a ship manufacturer and very, very, very wealthy. He was again an enormous collector of blue and white china and everything to do with the Orient. And he was a very early collector of Whistler. In fact, the picture on the extreme right, which we'll talk about later on, which is the Princess in the Land of Porcelain, was the first picture that he bought from Whistler. And that was painted as early as 1863, so it was 10 years before. It was bought, it was one of the first pictures were bought. The lady is called Spartelli. She was called Frances Spartelli, and she was a very famous beauty of the day. And she was much painted by Rossetti. But this particular picture was painted, but Spartelli didn't like it of his daughter. And as you see, she's wearing sort of the kimono. And again, this mixture of, you can see the blue and white at the back, this mixture of Chinese and Japanese influence. But the other two pictures are much, much later. They're painted in 73. And the picture of Leyland is based on Velasquez. His whole life, when he looked for etchings, he looked at Rembrandt. And when he looked at paintings, he invariably to look at, to be inspired by, it was Howes and Velasquez. And that particular one is based on the Velasquez painting. And the one in the center is his wife, Mrs. Leyland. This is now in the Freer collection. And it's a beautiful one, this one. And again, she literally couldn't pose an amount of time that he insisted, so his mistress, Maud Franklin, posed much for this one. But it's one of the lovely ones, this one, the center. And anyway, we're talking now, this is 1873. And he bought it, he moved into a new house in Prince's Gate, and he had it completely redone, and he'd spent an absolute fortune on it. And he asked Whistler for advice about the color of the study. Next one. And this is what Whistler did. Now, Leyland went abroad at this particular time, and this particular place this room was actually created for his collection of pottery. And of course, you see in the center his earlier picture of the Princess of the Land of Porcelain. Now, what Whistler was supposed to do, the man who built it was a man called Jekyll, and there'd been a sort of a scratch or something, and Whistler was supposed to sort of tidy what he actually did when Leyland was away. He completely ripped out the original decoration, and he himself decorated it. It was called the Peacock Room. And actually, he talks about how long, in these letters to Vanderbilt, how long it takes him to paint the ceiling and everything, all of the beautiful pots and so on are there. And when Leyland came back, he was absolutely furious. He charged him, he said it cost him 200,000. I think it's £200,000. And Leyland was so furious that he said he was only going to give him 100. But the point is, because this made Whistler out of pocket by it, but much more infuriating. It appears, I don't understand really, but it appears at this time when the artists gave their bills in, they were always in guineas. So not only was it 200,000, it was 200,000 guineas. And so when he finally paid him, he not only did he not pay him, but he paid him in pounds. And you only paid your butcher and your other people in pounds. You didn't pay gentlemen in pounds. And this was a great, great shock. But you see, the naughty Whistler, not only had he done this thing, but with Jekyll away, he had the press come and look at it. And he had all these artists come and look at it because he was terribly proud of it when it was finished. And of course, when Jekyll came back, he was absolutely furious because he was, apart from anything else, it was in all the newspapers, everybody knew about it, and a perfect stranger had come into his house, and that was the end of their relationship, so he lost the patron. Now, the interesting thing is that this man, Freer, bought it in 1904, and it was completely taken apart piece by piece. And it was first of all put in Detroit because it's where Freer lived. But finally, he put this museum up. So when you go to Washington, you've got to go to the Freer collection to see it. It is utterly beautiful. Gorgeous picture, a gorgeous thing. Okay, next one. Now, what with one thing and another, we're talking, incidentally, this was, the Peacock Room was 1876-77. And the combination of the collapse of the money with Leyland and all the performance that he was spending a fortune, he went bankrupt. And all of his stuff was sold, quite literally. Pictures were sold ridiculous. He had no money at all. He lost his house. He'd had a house built, which we'll talk about later, God with the White House. Everything went, and he had no penny, no money at all. And the Fine Arts Society came to his rescue, and he gave him a commission to go to Venice to actually do 12 etchings of Venice. And this is literally all he had, the only money he had. And of course, he borrowed money and did all sorts of peculiar things. But we are now going to look at these etchings. Now, this is according to all the people who talk about etchings. They were the most innovative etchings ever seen that he finally did. And they really are beautiful. The one on the left is the balcony. Remember how fine the earlier one, when he was looking at realism. They've got the sort of the mysticism of the nocturnes, but in fact in etchings. And the one in the middle is called the doorway. These are all, he was in, as it turns out, he was in Venice for about sort of 18 months. And they're 1879 to 80. And the one on the right, which I think is absolutely wonderful, is the latest one. That's 1880. That was from the second Venice set. Now look at the softness of the color. And one of the things that's tremendously interesting, at this point, of course, there'd been Turner and everybody had painted Venice. But what he did that was so unusual, he tended to go to the back alleys, the small canals, the places where the business sense of etching of Venice is what you get with these etchings. They are quite marvelous. Okay, the next one. And here are the painting. I think they're absolutely, again, these are very much like the nocturnes. And this is blue and silver, the lagoon. These are 79 to 80. And the one on the right, which I think was one of the first he did, and that, of course, is St. Mark's Cathedral. Aren't they exquisite? Again, that tiny speck of light that just gives you the sense of space around the back of the cathedral there. They're absolutely marvelous. Whilst he was in etching, while he was in Venice, he not only did he do etching, but he suddenly decided to work with pastel. And for the first time, the next one, we see the pastels. And look at them. Aren't they exquisite? The one on the left is called the Little Canal. Now look at that carefully. Isn't that gorgeous? Look at the reflection of the houses and the water. And that little tiny bridge. And you remember in Venice, when you go down the side canals and you see these tiny little bridges. The one in the middle, which is the side canal, and it's grey and red, and that's 79. And can you see, you're looking through into, and you can see the water in the centre there. You've got this mark and this sort of T-shaped thing, which becomes very interesting in his etchings. But I think the one on the left is one of the most beautiful. The one on the right is, again, nobody else was interested in the commercial side of Venice except he. And this particular one is all about business, because this is called the Zateri, and it is Harmony in brown. But it's the commercial waterfront. This is all the ships coming in with the food and so on. They are absolutely beautiful. He came back to England in the 80s, and the aristocracy wouldn't ask him to he had to make money again. And so his customers became the kind of nouveau riche. So let's look at the next one. And here they are. And this lady, again, I urge you, if you can, go on the computer and look up Whistler. And there's this marvelous story about this lady. She's called Lady Meux, Meux, and she's 1881. Now, she was, it appears, scandalous because she was possibly a prostitute, but certainly a sort of actress. And she was married to this very, very wealthy man. And he thought she was absolutely wonderful. So there were actually 3 paintings of her. The final one has been destroyed, but I think they're absolutely wonderful. This particular one is arrangement in black, and this was 1881. The one in the middle is so lovely. This is in the Frick. This is the harmony in pink and grey, and this is 81 to 83. And there, as I say, a third one, which you don't see, but the one in the middle, I think, the combination of the silk, of that pink silk and the white. They're absolutely beautiful. Now, the one on the far right is interesting because he was in France. He went to France and, of course, he met his friends, particularly by now, Manet and Degas had reputations. And this particular man is Theodore Durey, and he was really a supporter of particularly Degas. And he was, they persuaded Whistler to do a painting of him, and he's a sort of the local important critic of this group. And the pink scarf is literally for colour. It's a woman's scarf, but it's a beautiful painting, this one. And this one is 1883. It's called Arrangement in Black, and it's a beauty. Okay, next one, because this is interesting. The picture on the left is by Degas, but it's Mary Cassatt. Now, Mary Cassatt came from a very, very upper class Philadelphian family. She and her sister, brother-in-law, her sister-in-law and brother came to Paris and wanted their picture painted. And Cassatt sent them to Renoir, but they didn't like Renoir's pictures. So she then sent them to Whistler. So in the center, you've got Mrs. Cassatt. And on the left, exactly the same year, this is 1885, it's Degas painting Mary Cassatt. So there's Degas there, and there's Mrs. Cassatt Arrangement in Black, and this is 18 to 84. And as I say, they were Philadelphian aristocrats. Now, the one on the far right is interesting because obviously Whistler wanted to was very impressed with, he was impressed with their sort of upper class background. But most importantly, of course, there was the connection between Degas and Mary Cassatt. And he gave them the picture on the right. And it was, in fact, it was called The Chelsea Girl, and he calls it a sketch. And it was given to the Cassatts after he'd finished painting Mrs. Cassatt. And I think it's very, very, it's a sketch. And you see it's sort of the underpainting there. It's a nice little painting, that one. Both of those were 84. Okay, next one. He's got this new mistress, and his style changes about this time. We're talking really around about 83, 84, 1883, 80. And the one on the left is the arrangement in red, pink and purple. And she was the daughter of the Duchess of Caracola, who was a sort of a Spanish aristocrat. But most importantly, her godfather was the Prince of Wales, who was going to be sort of Edward VII. So he's sort of back into the moderately aristocratic clientele again. That's the one on the left. The one on the center is Maud Franklin. Both of these two are Maud Franklin, his current girlfriend. Now, what is importantly interesting, which one never talks about, Joe looked after his illegitimate son, of which we never hear any more about, and he had 2 daughters with this Maud Franklin, and we only know their names and their dates of their birth. There's never any more discussion about them. But this particular one is noted red, and it's the Siesta, And it's again, there's more around. The other one is the Yellow Room, and both of these are Maud Franklin. Now, this is, as I say, he had two daughters by her. Okay, next one. And it's back again. These, I think, are marvelous. These are London Bridge. These are 85. But look at the ones at the top. These are Chelsea. This is the area of Chelsea where he lives. And this particular one is the Carlisle Sweet Shop. And the other one is the blue and yellow shop of Chelsea of 87. And I think these are very interesting. Gives us an idea what Chelsea used to look like. Okay, next one. This is the Chelsea Street. Very interesting. I don't really know what street it is, but this is, I think this particular one is just called Chelsea Street. And this is again about 87. Now, in 1888, he marries for the first time. He's over 50. He's over nearly 50, and he marries the widow of the architect Godwin, and together they go to Amsterdam. Actually, they start. He spends quite a lot of time traveling to Amsterdam, most of all to see the Rembrandt, but basically because he was terribly well known as an etcher, and the Dutch Etching Society were always asking him to come. Okay, next to, because what he did in Amsterdam, he does his first watercolors, and these are the watercolors. So we're seeing, you see, that he's not only an etcher, oil painting, those marvelous pastels, and now he's going to do these watercolors. And these particular ones, the Nocturne, it's the Grand Canal on 1884, and the one on the right is the same time, and that's Black and Red Canal, that's 83, 84, and these are the watercolors. And he and his wife went at that point. She was actually the daughter of a sculptor, and she had been a sort of an art student. It wasn't really an art student in those days, because ladies certainly weren't expected to work, but she was always interested in art. She'd been married to Godwin, and Godwin died in 1886, and she and Whistler married. Okay, next to. And these particular ones are of when they go to Amsterdam together, and the one on the left is an etching and a dry point, but the bridge on the one on the lower right is a lithograph, and because of her interest, he begins to use lithography, and these are the general opinion is that these particular Amsterdam etchings are the best ones he does, and the details I think are quite extraordinary. The one on the lower right is quite late. That's 1899 to 100, and that's Flushing, Holland. But the top one, the one top one and the one on the left are both the same time, and they're 89. Now he was blissfully happy. I don't know what he did with poor Maud Franklin and his two children. You never hear any more about them. Okay, next one. I gather it was all rather difficult, because this is what she looks like. And this house is very important, because this was the White House in Tite Street. Now, this was originally commissioned when he was in his, before he got bankrupt, when he was at his richest. And this was in Tite Street. And it was 1877, and the designer, the architect was Edward Goodwin. And the point about it was a large house, but it was also a big studio. His idea was that he was going to have a group of not so much students. They were sort of, they actually worked with him. I mean, he had a great number of young people interested in his work. And at that time, his wife, Godwin's wife, was Beatrice Godwin, And he did this painting of her in 1885. And Godwin died in 86. And as I say, eventually he married her in 1888. Okay, next one. And these last pictures are very interesting because not only does he marry her, he marries he gets involved with the family. Now, the family actually was like the father of these women, was this rather interesting sculptor. It was called John Burney Phillips. And this picture, his wife's sister, became his favorite model. And she was called Ethel. She was called Ethel Phillips, and eventually she was married, so she's called Mrs. Whibley. But all of these are of her. She became his favorite model. And the one on the left is a mother of pearl and silver. That's called the Annual Lucian, and it's 1888 to 1900. The one in the center is the red and black fan, again the same time. And the one in the harmony and brown, the felt hat, is the 1890s. And she became, as I say, his most important and interesting model. I gather he was they all say it was a tremendously successful marriage, but very sadly she got cancer and she died after they'd only been married about 5 or 6 years. Okay, next one. And the last one, one on the left, it was she who encouraged him to do lithography. And so we're looking at one of the first of his lithographs on the left, and it's his wife and his sister Ethel, the duet of 1894. Now the one in the center is interesting. This is Stephen Mallarmé, because at one point, to defend himself really, he did this series of lectures which were called the 10 o'clock lectures, and they were eventually published in a pamphlet form. And Stephen Mallarmé, the French poet and writer, tremendously important figure for Degas and Manet, translated it into French for him, and they became great, great friends. And he visited Mallarmé in his country house. He did this rather beautiful drawing of him in the center. And this is 94, but the picture on the right, I think, is very sweet because this was Mallarmé's daughter, and she's called Genevieve. And she was 13 years old in 97, and he was visiting the father, and he did this very, very quick painting of her in 97. And again, this is really only one sitting. It gives you an idea of the way he started to make work. Okay, next one. Now these are the final important figures, and the one on the left, he's a very important figure, sort of intellectual figure, a French figure. He's called Robert de Montesquieu, and this is 1891. And these are all, looking at, you can see it, he's looking at Velázquez in this one. The one in the center is very important as far as the Americans are concerned, because this is George Vanderbilt. This is the young Vanderbilt, absolutely incredibly wealthy. And he came to England to be painted by Whistler. And he started it in 97, but he didn't finish to 1903, and I don't think he ever really quite finished it. But so you've got, on the left, you've got 91, you've got this Robert de Montesquieu. In the center, you've got Vanderbilt, 97, possibly 93. But the one on the right is very interesting because he is a blacksmith. When his wife became very, very ill, they went for the summer really, to Lyme Regis, and he was the blacksmith of Lyme Regis, and he liked him enormously, and so he painted him. So you've got here these two aristocratic figures in this rather lovely painting of the blacksmith, and that was painted in 95, 96. Okay, next one. Now he always had these extraordinary patrons who wanted something very, very special. In this particular collection was a man called Hutchinson, and he was passionate about Japanese generally, and particularly, of course, there's an extraordinary passion for blue and white china. And the painting, the thing we're looking on the left, was actually a design for a mosaic. And this was going to be put up in the new Victoria and Albert Museum, but it was never done. But the actual drawing for it was bought by this man Hutchinson, and this particular one here was possibly done in the 80s. And the one on the right, which was the Japanese dress, and this was done in 88, 89. And this, I put these on to show you his kind of draftsmanship. It's very interesting. And there's always this extremely decorative sense of the flowers and so on at the same time. Okay, next one. Now these are I'm fascinated that he paints these little girls, because remember, God knows what happened to them, but he'd had two little girls with Ward Franklin, of which nothing is known except they were born. Now these two little girls are not those children. This is called the Little Rose of Lyme, Regis, and she's called Rose Randall. She was the daughter of the mayor of Lyme, Regis when he was there. And this particular one is 1887. And the one in the center is just called Lily, and she was called Lily Parmington. He saw her in the street in Chelsea, and he persuaded her mother to bring her to his studio so he could paint her. Now, why was he painting these little girls? Has it got to do with what happened to his mysterious children that we know nothing about? And the little one is called, the last one is called Little Juniper Bud. And again, she's called Lily Smith. She's 8 years old. And this was the daughter of his housekeeper. And I think this is extremely puzzling that right at the end of his life, he should paint these little girls. Okay, next one. Now, these are perhaps the saddest. As I say, they were very happy together. There was no doubt it was a very good marriage. But she became terribly ill. And she had, as I said, persuaded him to do lithography. And if you look at the one on the left, it's absolutely beautiful. It's looking out of the window of the Savoy Hotel. Can you see the bridge in the background? And she's very, very ill with cancer. And this is her. It's just called By the Balcony. They're both 1896. She died that same year. And the one on the right, I think, is incredibly poignant. Look at the expression of the face. And it's called the Siesta. But of course, she's dying. They're beautiful drawings. He was absolutely, completely destroyed at her death. His secretary at that time became her youngest sister. She was only 22 when Beatrice died, and she became really Whistler's housekeeper and supporter. And her own mother, she became sort of she looked after them both in the house in Chelsea. And we'll put the next one on because it's the last one. I've put you the picture on the extreme left is a much earlier self-portrait. This was a self-portrait of 1872. As I say, he was a dandy. He had black hair, he had a white streak in his hair, and he was always tremendously well dressed. Now, all the time he was looking at Velázquez, and this particular Velázquez, which is Pablo Valladolid, and it was 1636-37, and he based his self-portrait on that, and that he'd seen in Madrid. And the particular, no, I think that one is in Madrid, and this is the very, very last self-portrait, and this is called Brown and Gold, and he was starting it on, his wife died in 96, and he started it in 95, and he didn't think that he could possibly finish it. He couldn't paint anymore. He was absolutely distraught, and Rosalind Burney Philip, who was his sister-in-law. She's 20 years old. She was his secretary. She looked after him and his mother, and he left her. Again, no mention of his daughters. He left her all his stuff, and she inherited everything. And over here, her life, she went on to collect the rest of his work. Now, interestingly, it was she who gave the work to the Hunterian Museum in Glasgow. So when you go to Glasgow, there are two places where there's an enormous amount of his work. One is the Freer collection, which is now in Washington, and the other is in Glasgow.
Right next to the
Yes,
Macintosh house.
Yes, it's and this is where you see these pictures.
Thank you, that was marvellous.
Did you enjoy that?
Loved it.